So, today we're going to take a look at Luke chapter 24, and we are going to be talking about Jesus' victory, his victory. Now, yesterday was a great day for me because it was the ending of a long drought, and that drought is the sports drought. You know, you got all through the summer, I know you got baseball, and if you're a baseball fan and you like to watch baseball and keep up with baseball, that's great. To me, it's a little bit boring, so I don't do that. But then all of a sudden, when football hits, especially when college football hits, that's like the ending of a long drought. And so yesterday it was the ending of a long drought for me because here college football was back on. And one thing that I thought about yesterday, and that is, you got a big game, right? And so you're there, you're watching the big game, and even though it's not you competing in the big game, it's that you are watching the big game. And then when there is a victory, there is joy that goes along with it. And it's kind of a axiom that is that the bigger the victory, the bigger the joy, right? Okay. Well, if you think about Jesus' resurrection, Jesus' victory, this is probably, I think, it is the biggest event in all of human history of what happened that morning when Jesus rose from the dead. And I know that some people will say, well, wait a minute, what about the creation of mankind? Well, okay, yeah, you had the creation of mankind, but if you don't have the resurrection, then you've got all of mankind dying and going to hell with no hope. So, to me, that puts the resurrection of Jesus Christ on a little bit bigger of a scale than the creation of mankind, right? At least it is to me. I don't know about you. That's the way it is to me. And some people say, well, wait a minute, when Jesus comes back again, that's a big deal too, and it is a big deal too. That's when everything is going to climax and come back to the Father. But if we didn't have Jesus doing what he did on the cross and being resurrected, then we would never have the fulfillment that all of those of what takes place in order for that to happen. And so, if you look at it that way, resurrection is a big deal. And so if you think about this resurrection being this big deal and this big victory, you would think that the disciples that morning would be absolutely ecstatic, right? But they weren't. Why not? Well, that's one thing that we're going to take a look this morning. When we take a look at Jesus and his meeting two disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24, starting in verse 13. So let's read it together. Luke chapter 24, starting in verse 13. It says this: Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know that these things have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was going to be the one that was going to redeem Israel. What is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he was going a little further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he is at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the Scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There were found the 11, and those with them assembled together, and saying, "It is true, the Lord had risen and appeared to Simon." Then the two told of what happened on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Now, these disciples that we look at today, and going back to a couple months ago when we looked at the disciples and that little lesson about Jesus' disciples, we oftentimes think of the 12 disciples and just simply assume that that's all that there were. But there was more. As a matter of fact, here we see two. One of them is named Cleopas. And you say, well, who is Cleopas? He was a disciple on the road to Emmaus. That's about it. And then there's another one, and he doesn't even get his name mentioned. So, there were people that were disciples of Jesus and probably pretty close to Jesus and pretty close to what was going on from what we see here in the conversation that took place. And so here are these two disciples, and they have kind of a very different reaction than what we would normally assume. As a matter of fact, we see here, as far as our first point, is that the day that Jesus arose, the disciples, instead of being overjoyed of what was going on, the disciples were again very afraid. They were very confused. They didn't understand a whole lot of things, as did these two. Now, we're going to pick on these two this morning, but at the same time, you go and you read through the different Gospels, you see that the women were afraid to talk to what was going on. We see that night the disciples were in a locked room because they were afraid of the Jews. So there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of different things that were taking place instead of the joy that should have been taking place. Now, these two disciples that we see here was that on the day of the resurrection, and they probably left pretty early in the day, that these two were traveling from Jerusalem to a little village called Emmaus. And as it says there in verse number 13, that it was about 7 miles away. And so these two were walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And as they were walking along, we see that they were talking and discussing all the things that were going on, and Jesus kind of walks up alongside of them. Now, we may kind of think, well, isn't that a little bit odd? If you're traveling and somebody just kind of travels with you, wouldn't that be a little bit of a, in our culture, that probably would be a little bit, what are you doing? But you got to remember that in that day and time, that's how people traveled, right? In our day and time, we jump in the car and we turn on the radio, or we put in MP3, or we do something to entertain ourselves to pass the time. When we were traveling back from Texas this past week, we had movies. Put a movie in the DVD player, and I'll just listen to it. I won't watch, while I'm driving, more or less. Okay, so that's how we kind of pass the time. But in that day and time, you didn't have those things. It's not like you're walking along and, hey, how about somebody put in a DVD and let's watch it as we're walking, or somebody turn on the radio, let's listen to it. You didn't have that. And so if you were going to be walking long distances like that, you would sit there and you would pass the time by talking with somebody. Very novel idea, right? And so you would talk and you would discuss, and it would be something that, as many people would be traveling up and down the road, and this would have been time Passover, that a lot of people would have been traveling. Wouldn't be surprising if somebody comes up, now I'm going to join this conversation for a little bit. Well, I'm going to skip over here and I'm going to change the channel and join this conversation over here for a little bit. And so there's a lot of fluidity there. So here's these two disciples. They're walking along the road, and Jesus just kind of comes along upside, and what are you two discussing? Now, they are prevented from recognizing Jesus because he wants to get at the heart of this certain situation. As a matter of fact, that when Jesus comes up to them and says in verse number 17, what are you discussing together as you walk along? Notice that the very last part of that verse is, they stood still with their faces downcast. Have you ever, you're walking along, you're talking with somebody, and then all of a sudden somebody says something that is just so jaw-dropping that you just stop what you're doing, and you're like, okay. And that's the disciples. They are going, they're walking, they're trying to get to their destination, but what Jesus asks them is so mind-boggling that they stop. Okay? Now notice it says here that their faces are downcast. You say, well, what do you mean downcast? I mean, obviously we understand what downcast is. Downcast is that you're, right? Okay. But there's more to that word than just simply that. What this is it's going to be a visual expression of something that is expressing some sort of inner turmoil that is occurring somewhere. As a matter of fact, in other places, not necessarily the Bible, but in other literature, this word is talking about somebody who's gloomy. Okay? You think about somebody who's downcast. You think about somebody who has a gloomy expression about them. But more than that, it's talking about somebody who's serious. Somebody who's deep in thought. And you talk and you think about somebody who's really thinking about something. Right? They're really serious. Okay? It's really something emotionally troubling. That's downcast. All right? So that's what these disciples were doing. They were simply, it's not just simply sadness, but there's this element of not understanding all the things that are going on. And I want you to stop and think about it. Can we relate to this? How many times do we just don't understand what's going on, right? We look at all the things that we hope God is doing, that we think God is doing. We look at our lives and we think, well, you know what? God, we think is going to be doing this, but I see that this is taking place and I just don't get it. It's confusing to me. I don't comprehend it. And I'm just kind of gloomy, downcast. Have you ever had that happen to you before? Where you just cannot understand what God is doing. You know God's doing something. You know it's going to be good. But at the same time, it just doesn't feel that way at the moment. And you're left perplexed, you're left confused, you're left downcast. And that's what these disciples were doing, right?